Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're just admitting everyone, and we'll probably have a few people joining in the next couple of minutes, and there'll be a quick intro from me, and then I'll hand over to Layla. So we're here for a session considering anti-racist practices in the global solidarity sector, as you hopefully know, and we've got plenty of people joining. Thanks everyone for coming along. We'll crack on. I don't want to spend too much time on the intro. Thanks Melvin, ahead of the game there, introducing himself on chat. There's a slide prompt in a minute, but please do let us know your name and organisation. And I'll just do a quick run through of what we've got coming up as part of this programme on the next slide. And then a bit of housekeeping from me. Are you able to just skip on to the next one, Layla? Thank you, brilliant. So this is our last full session, full webinar as part of the Small International Development Charities Programme, which has been running 2021 and 2022. So I hope you can join us next week for our wrap up. We'll be sort of sharing some key learning and top tips, and hopefully that's a bit of a fast track to some future support for everybody. So do come along if you can. Some of the things that are going to continue to be available after the actual funded programme are our e-learning topics. We've got 2 sessions there, and our recordings, our event recordings. We've got about 25 of those, so there's lots available for people to catch up on, so do check those out. And bursaries, so it's your last chance as international charities to access the free FSI training with no deposit, so do check that out. And there's also your last chance as well to get involved in our peer support match scheme. So it's been a great little add-on to the programme where we've been matching people in the back end for organisational similarities or similarities in role, and then we send you off to have a bit of a chat. And it's quite a nice sort of informal little networking option there for you. So there'll be a poll at the end with just a few very quick questions about the session, and then an opt-in for that peer support match at the end of the session if you're keen for that. And then the next slide, we just got a bit of a note about format. So we'll be using the chat function, and we'll have lots of breakouts. I'll be keeping an eye on the chat, so do pop any questions or queries in there, and I can flag to Layla if there's something that's coming up. There might not be a huge amount of time for questions, but you can always follow up with us. Do get in touch if you've got anything to get back to us about. And slides will be available after the session, and there is a recording if anyone wants to catch up or share with a colleague. You will have seen a live streaming notification. We are recording the session, but no one is watching us currently. The live streaming just refers to our closed captioning service, which sort of speaks to itself in a way that's called live streaming. But if that's helpful for you to enable closed captions, then that'll be an option for you. As I mentioned, evaluation form towards the end, and we've got the brilliant Layla from Be Diverse, and she's got a couple of questions as well. So really helpful for us if you're able to quickly feedback. Do feel free to turn off your cameras if you like. The session is being recorded, as I say, but the breakout little sessions won't be. Great, so there's a few, on the next slide, there's a few notes just about getting the best from today. So do participate, do get involved. You know, this is going to be a very participatory session. There's a lot of sort of independent thinking to be done, so keep involved, keep it as a safe space. Confidentiality obviously applies for people in your breakout rooms. Keep in touch, introduce yourself and keep in touch, especially if there's commonalities there with your organisations. We really encourage that. And then just standard courtesy stuff. Do try and be on time. Try and be concise with your questions. We might not have a huge amount of time for verbal Q&A, but just concise is appreciated. Waiting your turn to speak, removing distractions, and mute, please, when you're not talking. And then the next slide is just encouraging you to put your name and your role in the chat. I think we're just about on schedule. Good. I didn't want to go on too long with that bit, so I'll hand over to Layla, the wonderful Layla. Thank you so much from Be Diverse. I will hand over to you, and please do pop intros in chat, everyone.
Good, I was going to say morning then. Good afternoon, everybody. Really nice to see some of your faces, some of your photos, some of your names, and I hope I get to see some of you a bit more as today goes on. Thank you for that, Remy. I will get going. I have a tendency to waffle sometimes and kind of go off script and get really excited and passionate with what I'm talking about. So that may happen today. I've got 2 slides. So if you can see my image kind of going side to side, it's because I might be looking at what I've got on the other presentation slide. To check my notes, etc. And as Remy said, I may not see things coming into the chat because when you use 2 screens, there's lots of kind of things going on. So if there's anything burning, Remy will highlight it, but we might not have loads of time for that today. Also, I apologize, or maybe it doesn't need an apology, in case you hear my dog snoring in the background. She's quite quietly snoring now, or making any other noise. I don't have any planned fire alarms, but if the doorbell rings, she might alert me, and then we'll just wait for her to calm down. So, who am I? My name is Layla Osmani. My pronouns are she, her, and I founded Be Diverse as a training organisation in 2016. One of the reasons that I founded Be Diverse is I was initially working as a youth worker and then working with EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion topics with young people and youth workers across Europe. And unfortunately, we lost European funding because we left the EU. And I didn't want to lose the opportunities for this work, so I started doing it off my own back. And my employment has taken me down different paths. So I always stay part-time employed and do my freelance work as well. I think it's important for me to have a kind of diversity of experiences. And my work started going more into organizational development, but especially looking at anti-racism and anti-sexism, also because of my lived experience as an employee in certain organizations, and being a participant in projects. So that's where I've kind of come to today. There's a lot to cover in the topic or under the topic and theme of anti-racism. This really is a kind of introduction. I recognize that some people will be coming here very early in their journey. Some people may have more of an understanding of anti-racism. There's also people in this space who have experienced racism and people who haven't. So we're going to be going light touch, and as Rowie said, it is a webinar format. These are the areas on the screen that I'll be covering, but there's lots of stuff that I won't be covering. So that includes things like the kind of timeline of racism and how it really has developed over history, and the history specifically of race in the UK. I won't be looking at things like legislative frameworks, so the Equality Act, etc. And I won't be spending time with you to personally explore your power. We'll look at power as a concept. That's something I invite you to do later on. We also won't be looking at really important topics such as lived experience of racism, systemic discrimination, and then allyship and how that can be challenged. And allyship is a huge part of anti-racism, especially for people who don't experience oppression. And then with that, I won't be looking at kind of how we can actively challenge racism within current structures and systems, especially in our organizations, in the specifics of governance or recruitment or finances. But we will be thinking about the theory that kind of incorporates as a baseline to that. The last thing to say here is around my training style. So as I said, I was a youth worker. My training is usually experiential. I believe that especially with these topics that are lived experiences, for people to learn and understand about them, it's also important to have some kind of active learning involved, not just be passive. And we'll understand that it's not just theory, even though there is theory here. So with that, I try to be as interactive as possible. This is my first time doing a webinar, so usually I do a lot less talking and I'm getting people to ask questions, do activities, go into small groups, bigger groups, etc. Because of that, I did, when I was devising this and the framework for today's speak with Remy and Vic, and we've decided to use breakout rooms. So this is going to be a moment for you to be a bit more active in your learning. You'll have between 5 and 10 minutes after each theme with a pair. So there's only going to be 2 people. So there's not going to be chances to shy away and not talk, to discuss some breakout questions, discuss what you thought of the theme, discuss how that may have applied to your context. And share that with each other. We won't be coming back and then sharing with everyone. We're not working with that format, but it's proven that if you're active in your learning, it's a lot more likely to embed. And I think that reflection on learning, especially in these topics, is crucial, really, to make it more than just a checklist. So with that, there's also timekeeping. So we will be trying to keep to time. That's more for myself than anyone else, because especially in the virtual classroom, let's say, we can manage your time by just bringing you back to the space. I need to manage my own time, either with Remy eyeballing me or with myself looking at my other screen and being like, oh God, I've completely gone over time. So I'll move on. Before we get into the first topic, therefore, I just wanted to talk about why we're here. The increased desire for this kind of training and beyond, we must recognise, has been sparked by the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter activism started in late 2012, 2013, but after the murder of George Floyd in the United States in 2020, the spotlight has once again been shone on racism and issues of racism across the world. And I think it's really positive that a lot more people are engaging in this topic in a proactive sense, again, like I say, beyond just a theoretical sense. But it's really important to recognize this, because we can sit in theory, especially when we're doing these things through kind of just classroom learning experiences. So I want us to remember today that what we cover in this session is, and what you may consider through your ongoing learning around the topic, is not just a course, that this is something that impacts real lives, and that the things that you do impact real people, even if you don't see it directly. We know that across the world still today, Black people and other people of colour and racialised communities are dying because of racism. We've seen this through COVID, we've seen this through migration, Windrush, the rise of the far right, and we see this with the continuation of modern day colonialism. But these are real lives, and I always start with this because I don't want this to be forgotten. So we're going to actually start with a minute's silence, and I want in this time for you to remember the people that have died at the hands of racism. A lot of people bow their heads, however, I encourage you to actually look at the screen, read the quote on the left that I think really encapsulates this point well. And on the right is the names of all the people in the UK who have, racialised people in the UK who have died at the hands of the police. So not at the hands of racism overall, but just at the hands of the police. And that's not all of them. Again, we sometimes think that it doesn't happen here, but it definitely does. So I'm going to invite us for a minute's silence, and then we'll move on. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to go to the next slide then, and start with our topics here. Okay, great. Just going to shift some of my windows around again so I can see things properly. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start with understanding systems of oppression and making sure that we're all on a common ground when we recognize what's at play in the society that we live in today. This is really important when we consider anti-racism, that we consider these systems, and that it's not just about tackling individual acts of racism, but really about starting to tackle racism from its roots. So I'm going to use a tree analogy that signifies society. This was, I went to a training a couple of years ago by an organization called Decolonizing Economics. I will, in the slides that are shared, there are references and links to everyone who I talk about today and who I learned from. Decolonizing Economics do incredible work. And they use this analogy, and I found it a really helpful way to explain and understand systems of oppression. And I've used it quite a lot, and people always feedback that it's really helpful. So bear with me, and hopefully it works for everyone here. So I'm going to start with the roots. My animations work, yes. When we look at this analogy, we consider that the roots are the ideas and beliefs and forces that kind of underpin society. These are the isms to an extent. So we've got some examples here, for example, patriarchy, we have racism, from which was born white supremacy, elitism, capitalism, ableism, and that there's plenty of these belief systems that are in place that spread smaller roots, which are kind of the offspring of these beliefs as well. If we look at the patriarchy, we have homophobia, we have transphobia, so they kind of spawn these others, and they get connected and interwoven just like the roots of a tree are. You can't separate them per se. So the roots of society is the ideological oppression that is in place, and it's these beliefs present ideas around what is right, what is the norm, and therefore uphold these concepts of what is right and what is the norm. We then have the trunk. The trunk in this analogy represents the organizations and the institutions that run society. We're looking at Western, global North, European societies that we know and understand, that have of course been transplanted through colonization across the globe. So these institutions are there, and they are all fed by the roots. So they're all fed by these ideas and ideologies, and I've put some on the screen there. This is by no means all of them, and again you then have smaller institutions and organizations that branch off of these within the world that we live in. What's really important with these is that these organizations and people who run them and work for them, who are socialized by the roots and the ideologies, are what creates what we see as the branches. So they are the people that are creating these laws, these policies, these practices, processes, systems that decide the way in which society is run. So the rules by which we have to do things. And these rules are based on ideas of what is right and what is the norm, because they are, of course, fed by the roots. So this is where we see institutional oppression take place. And this creates tangible barriers that get in the way of certain people who are usually not seen as the norm or not seen as being right, having access to the same opportunities and outcomes as others. And so, of course, then we have the leaves or the buds on the trees. And these are usually on a tree during spring, summer, what you see the most of course, and they fall to the ground in the winter. But it's the kind of biggest part of the tree. It's the most obvious part of a tree. And these represent the inequalities that we see on the ground. So these represent how we see inequalities play out between different groups of people. Unfortunately, with this analogy, which was something that I added on after I've been thinking and working with it for a long time. I kind of thought, well, also, yeah, come winter, obviously in the UK, but leaves fall off and they go down and they create mulch and they feed the roots. And so they kind of maintain these beliefs. So it's really common that people, when they're not aware of the rest of the tree in this analogy, especially the legislation and the policies, because the leaves just cover them all up, they're not considerate about like how these institutions create these policies, and they definitely don't see the roots. They just see these inequalities, these symptoms. They create stereotypes. They believe that those are true. And this is where the individual and interpersonal demonstrations of oppression come in. So if I kind of feed through what we've got on the screen here, just to give a demonstration, you can see I've used some different colors. This was me trying to kind of thread through how certain ideologies lead to certain inequalities. But in all honesty, everything, as I said, is intertwined. The reason why none of the institutions are in any color but black is because they're all fed by all the ideologies and beliefs and forces. It's nigh on impossible to find institutions and organizations that aren't impacted, because these systems are so deep rooted. But given the context that we're here today, if we think about racism and white supremacy, that's fed up. And as we know, commonly, I've already referenced police brutality as impacts police justice and the criminal justice system, who then have produced policies of stop and search to replace kind of historical sus laws in the UK that we therefore know disproportionately target young black men, and young black men and black men in general are disproportionately represented in the carceral system in the UK. So here we can see, and then what does the public see? What do other people see? They see that there are more black men in prison. This creates a stereotype that black people are more likely to be criminals. And so therefore that feeds this belief of white supremacy, that white people are superior to people of color. So we can see how these systems work. And before I move on, I just want to kind of, I suppose, conclude on this topic that, or reiterate, maybe I should say, how important this is to remember, and especially when it comes to anti-racism. And when we look later at kind of theories around anti-racism, this is because, again, it's not just about tackling that over one-to-one, someone said something situation. We really are moving into a space where if you want to be anti-racist, we need to start challenging systems of oppression. Tackling and challenging just an individual or one policy or one way of doing things is going to be part of a bigger movement, but we have to have our mind on those roots, essentially. And now it's also important for me to say that I don't know everything. Like, I'm learning with this. I'm always learning, and I see inequalities, but I always try and consider, why are these things happening? What policies are in place that are creating this? And again, I mean, we look at health and medicine. I didn't know anything about medical policies. COVID hit, everything was coming into the news about racialized people being disproportionately impacted. And if you access certain news, then you'd understand how it was due to medical policy that led to that. Perfect. What am I doing? Okay. So just very briefly then, I just want to touch on race and ethnicity. So it may be controversial, but it appears that racism hasn't always existed, let's say, in the way that we know now. Race is a social construct, and again, that's something that there's not space in my world to debate. And race therefore purports with this social construct to distinguish fixed racial characteristics based on observable physical difference. So, for example, skin color, hair type, facial features. Racism is a belief in racial differences between people, which has been used to justify discrimination historically. And while racism seeks to define individuals, and I find this quite interesting, it seeks to define individuals by their purported race, as mentioned earlier, suggesting that certain characteristics are inherent, are biological within certain racial groups. The stereotypes associated with racism have shifted over time. So therefore, we see that racism is not static, but it's a shifting ideology, and therefore, to conceive that it's biological, anyone who does, I'm like, the math doesn't really add up. There's evidence from history, the Romans and in Greek societies, although they were brutal, they actually had no distinction between black and white. Trinidadian activist CLR James talks about how they had a different standard, which was civilized and barbarian, and you could have white skin and be barbarian, and you could have black skin and be civilized. There's, moving on from that, a lot of argument, I suppose, or analysis, conclusions that actually it was the transatlantic slave trade that gave rise to the ideology of racism. And when we look at Eric Williams, who was a Trinidadian scholar and actually the first independent prime minister there, he spoke about the fact that historically, when we look at the colonization of the Americas, there was a problem. A problem arose with plantation owners who were in a tiny minority, and they didn't want the indentured servants, so those were the white European criminals who they'd taken over, making common cause with the enslaved Africans. That had happened in the earlier days, and they'd rebelled together. So from the plantation owners' perspective, it was necessary to kind of create a barrier to this tendency for common cause. And that's where this ideology of racism grew up. It was based on dehumanizing black slaves, a lot based in Protestant belief that black people could not reach heaven. And years later, as slavery was abolished in the States, race and across the Americas, actually, Haiti being the first nation in the Americas to become independent, racism was suddenly enforced by a new pseudoscience of eugenics. It's important to recognize eugenicists because that's actually a lot of how kind of more recent racist contexts and political and historical contexts have come out of. And eugenicists created a hierarchy, basically, of races, and the so-called Anglo-Saxon race was at the top. And that's where white supremacism came from. It actually arose in academia, and it sought to kind of justify the disadvantage retrospectively, and the exploitation and the oppression that already existed as a result of the slave trade. So when we look, as I've just referenced, at a kind of present day or more recent history, it's very different across the world when it comes to racism. We see contexts where colorism and caste systems are still in place. They still kind of came from this same history and roots. When we look at India and South Asia, again, colonized by the British, who took these ideologies over with them. And now we know that there's lots of other groups that are targets of racism, and so our understanding of racism expanded, including anti-Semitism, anti-Irish sentiment that was prolific in the 60s and 70s, the hatred of Roma and traveller communities, asylum seekers and refugees, and Islamophobia as well. So it is changing, and this way of understanding the history was shared by Ella Baker's School of Organising, again, another organisation I will reference. So very quickly, before we go to our first breakout room, I just wanted to move in reverse and again look at what is oppression. So oppression is, when we're looking at this kind of sum here, let's say, it's a combined impact of prejudice and discrimination by someone with power that is derived from their position of privilege. So anyone can be discriminated against, but if the person or group of people doing the discriminating aren't in a relative position of power and privilege, then it's not oppression. Oppression is systemic, which means it's not just about one-off or one-to-one instances of discrimination or prejudice. It's a process of discrimination that's been proactively woven into the fabric of society and the world that we live in. And privilege can lead many people to find it hard to believe that discrimination or oppression is a thing, because it hasn't happened to them, or they see acts of discrimination as not a big deal, or things that only happen on occasion rather than it being systemic. Believing oppression isn't a problem is something that happens to people when it's not a problem for them. Great. So I'm just trying to see the time, running a little bit over time because that's what happens. Oh no, under time, we're good. We're going to go into breakout rooms. So we're going to go into pairs, as I mentioned earlier. For those who are new or joined a bit late, welcome. Remy is going to put you just into randomly allocated pairs, and I want you to, this is a prompt question. How does privilege, power, or oppression play out in your context? You're going to have 10 minutes in these breakout rooms, so that's quite a substantial amount of time for both of you to have a conversation and get into a conversation about this. You may want to talk about anything else that has been covered today as well so far in this first area of oppression and kind of the history of race and racism. So it's a space for you, but there's a prompt in case you're a bit like, oh, I don't know what to talk about. If you go into a room and your partner isn't there, they're not responding, then you can come back into the main space, or you can message Remy or myself, and Remy will be able to put you into maybe a 3. I'm not sure how many there are. I think there may be a trio anyway. But yeah, you'll have plenty of time. So don't just sit there by yourself, and if you don't want to. And again, I reiterate this for those who maybe arrived late. This space for reflection is really about embedding your learning. Chalk and board, death by PowerPoint, we've heard those terms before. For the majority of people, we don't actually take on the learning, and you walk away and you forget a lot of it. So by being able to have these conversations, this can really help. You can talk about your context and ask questions. That's the other thing, is we'll look later today at kind of fragility and discomfort. It's okay to not know. Like, there's so much we don't know. We are trained to be right. We're trained to get it right, put our hand up in class only if you have the answer, not to ask a question. If we want to move into kind of anti-racist ways of being, then being wrong is a space for learning, not knowing is a space for learning. So please bring those questions to each other. We won't be feeding back. We will see at the end of today if there's time for extra questions. So this is really a time for you. Remy, are we good?
Absolutely. I'm just getting them all up. Everyone will be invited in a moment. And yes, do pop back or flag to us if there's any problem, but we hope it's a really helpful conversation in pairs. Thanks, everyone. I'll just open those rooms.
Not everyone ran back as soon as you got the countdown, so hopefully there was some useful conversations there. And this is where it's brutal, because I'm going to move on to the next topic. Great. So I mentioned that it's not all about theory, but of course there is theory, and there are ways of conceptualizing anti-racism in kind of frameworks. So I'm going to present an anti-racist framework that was developed by Ibram Kendi, and he published this in his book in 2019. He's done really incredible work, and the book also looks at kind of different types of racism that we kind of touched upon earlier. The bullet points, or the way that this framework is going to be presented onto the slide, was pulled together in a kind of more succinct format by an organization called DareConf, who I attended it was a 2-week-long residential just before lockdown. So then it ended up being a really intense course on anti-racism, and was really, really useful and really helpful to understand these kind of theories. It was very theoretical, but in a much deeper sense. So we'll talk through this. There's quite a lot. And then again, you'll have time in pairs to kind of think about how this may work for you. So the framework looks at 3 different approaches to policy to running the world. So when we looked at the tree and we looked at the institutions and then the policies that come out of those institutions, there's kind of like theories that go behind these. So the first historically was segregationist approaches to policy and racism, essentially. This is the historical racism that a lot of us are very conscious of, which was very overt racism. It was justified by theories of biological inferiority that I've mentioned already, and support, therefore, policies of segregation. We've seen policies of segregation historically in the United States before the Civil Rights Act. So even though slavery was abolished, there was still very clear differentiations between Black people and white people not being allowed to mix. We see policies of segregation, or we saw policies of segregation in South Africa during apartheid. We've seen it through Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And we see it now in Israel and regarding their approach to Palestine. So, and as well in Myanmar. So this still exists in the world. However, not so much in the Western world, the global North, Europe, maybe more enlightened areas. I say enlightened as in the Enlightenment, not not in a colonial way, but yeah, in what we see as the West, let's say. We have what is more assimilationist approaches to our policy and as assimilationist racism, let's say. So this comes from this kind of like liberal racism, this post-racial colorblind approach of we don't see race, we're all the same. It also encompasses racism by omission, oh sorry, I forgot, and tokenism, which is very common. And it's also this kind of approach of being not racist. I'm not racist, or we're not racist, rather than being proactively anti-racist. So it's very much about what you're not allowed to do, what you're not allowed to say, and it's about this kind of political correctness in a sense. However, it is racist, and it's justified by theories of cultural behavioral inferiority. So that's where it moves into this kind of concept of uplift, of development. We know historically, and even still today, we talk about international development. So it centers these kind of white Western perspectives and norms and approaches policy and institutions and work and the work that we do with, we want to bring up people to where we are, to be able to do things how we do. It's kind of this concept and the term that we don't use anymore of civilization. How can we ensure that people are more civilized? And with that, it kind of also centers around equality of opportunities. So, for example, in the UK, people will say, well, everyone can go to university, everyone can get a loan to go to university now, we'll have to pay it back, but you know, everyone has the opportunity to go to university. We know that that isn't the case because of the experiences that certain people, especially marginalized people, would have had leading up to the chance to go to university. And we also know once in university that the opportunity isn't equal. So again, assimilation is kind of approaches look at concepts of meritocracy, which is a myth, and therefore doesn't challenge existing power structures. It says these are the hierarchies, the power structures, the systems we have in place. As long as we get the same amount of people at the top, and as long as we kind of have representation, and as long as everyone has the chance to get there, well, then it's because of, you know, their own personal cultural behavioral experiences that means that they haven't been able to. So how has it been conceived within this framework when something is anti-racist? So anti-racism is justified by theories that no racial group is inferior, and therefore no racial group needs developing. It's not about trying to change people and change the way they do things, but actually everyone is as valid as the other. It supports equality of outcome. beyond equality of opportunity. And with that, it looks at equity. Equity is about providing people with support to be able to have the same access to outcomes. Because we have these systems of oppression, we're not all at the same starting line, we're not all born the same, we are not living in a meritocracy, therefore we have to support and provide more to certain people to be able to have the same access to outcomes as others. So with that, we look at considerations as well, supporting universal provision of services, supporting reparations, which looks at, you know, providing considerate support and appropriate support to people who have been impacted by oppression historically. With that, it challenges existing power structures. So to be anti-racist, you can't sit within power structures. Doesn't mean you're going to change those structures, but you are going to be actively challenging them and challenging systems of oppression. And this next, the next 2 points are really key with anti-racism, and something that a lot of people kind of learn when I do my work, that anti-racism is intersectional. It must be intersectional because people of color and racialized people are also queer, are also disabled, are also women, are also migrants, are also impacted by a lot of other elements of oppression and marginalization. So to be anti-racist, you have to ally with intersecting struggles. That doesn't mean you have to do it all, but it means that those considerations are there and you are within your values allying with them. So you've got to be feminist and anti-capitalist and abolitionist. You've got to center and consider LGBTQ plus rights, migrant rights, climate justice, etc., to be anti-racist. And with that, therefore, anti-racism has to centre oppressed and marginalised people and their perspectives. And we'll look later at concepts of decolonisation and a little bit about neocolonialism. Anti-racism is about moving away from those norms. So those roots have these beliefs about what's right, what is the norm. We have to centre the perspectives of others to recognise there are plenty of variations of what's right and what can be the norm, not just one. So you're going to pop off again. That was a bit of a short one, but quite a lot to digest, I suppose. And you're going to go in a similar format into pairs. This is a prompt question for you, which is, how could you change something in your organization to move towards being, I've written that wrong. How could you change something in your organization to move from being assimilationist towards being more anti-racist? That's a prompt. Discuss what you please. We'll have a bit shorter in this one just because of time. So we'll have about 6 to 7 minutes. Remy, when you're ready, I don't know if you're doing new groups or different ones.
I've mixed people up because we did discuss that, and if anyone's pairless, then we can do a bit of shuffling around. But thanks everyone. Yeah, you should have your invite to join.
Oh yeah, I do have actually the breakout rooms thing has popped up on my screen. Vicky and just John. Do you want to pause record? People are using all of those last few seconds, aren't they? It's great. Welcome back, everybody. Again, really nice to see people using those last few seconds. And again, brutally, there's no time for feedback, and I'm just going to move into our next topic. We're going to talk now about the third theme of today, which is looking at elements of whiteness in regard to the experience of white people in regard to racism. I want to highlight here 2 things before I start kind of going through this topic. and have a swig of water because I talk a lot and I get dry mouth. One is there are people in this space today with us who experience racism and who are not white. And so these things you may feel don't apply to you, and some of them won't apply to you, and that's absolutely fine. Some of the concepts may apply to you because some of the concepts have applied to me, and I'll share some of my experience through this next section as well. When it comes to going through this section, you may feel elements of discomfort. You may, viscerally kind of feel your body kind of closing up. You might start feeling a bit defensive. You might have kind of, just not feel comfortable by what is being presented, especially if you feel that this is about you. So on that note, there's two things. One, this is theory. So just because you are white, it also doesn't mean that you would have experienced all of these things. But also I think it's important to say and reiterate, as I said earlier with our breakout rooms, where questions are a space for learning, discomfort is also a place for learning. When we feel uncomfortable, it's our body telling us that actually, when we're looking at theory, not when we're looking at maybe social interactions, that when we're kind of thinking about these things, it's saying that it's giving you a message. It's giving you a message that there's a space that you can grow into. There's a message here that you're feeling discomfort, use that as a tool to be like, okay, I need to kind of work with this. I need to process this. I need to figure out how can I move through this. It's okay to feel discomfort and defensiveness. It's normal, it's natural. Again, we have, the majority of us, been brought up in a world of binaries, of right and wrong, of good and bad. And so to feel like we're being told we're not a good person or a bad person, we want to jump to our own defense. That's normal. It's the same with most conflict. It's, we're very kind of individualistic in our conflict of someone did this, that people are responsible for our emotions. So it's absolutely normal. But yes, I just wanted to kind of put that out there. It's also for people who've experienced racism, and with this and other stuff we may talk about, should have given a kind of not warning, but a recognition that some of these things can be traumatic. And we know that when we look at microaggressions, that actually people that experience microaggressions experience similar levels of PTSD as war veterans do. So to have to kind of sit as a racialized person or someone who's experienced racism and hear these things, it can be quite difficult. So I just invite you to look after yourself, feel yourself, for everyone here, and if you need to take time, do that. But also this is a space for you to learn, and I'm really pleased that you're here to learn. And so I hope that you'll take that on and then do something nice afterwards. So here I go, waffle, 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 all the potato waffles, because I prefer them to sweet waffles. I'm going to get on with the next one. Okay, so these terms that we're going to look at. White fragility. What is white fragility? This is exactly what I was saying. It's the discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. So it can be a kind of indignant reaction, and it's usually a combination of white fragility and white privilege. People personalize it. Examples of feeling this. So when we look at feelings and emotions, they usually are quickly followed by a thought, or vice versa. It can be hard to distinguish what's a feeling and what's a thought. So thoughts might be, not me, this isn't me, it's not my fault, that was years ago, it's not, I wasn't there, all I'm trying to do is help, it's not all white people, and yeah, like not liking to hear the term white used as a generalization, and a lot of people struggle with concepts of whiteness. Again, I invite you to explore that. We won't look at it now. The next one is white guilt. So white guilt is remorse or shame felt by a white person with respect to racial inequality and injustice. So it kind of can make the problems of racialized people secondary to the need for white redemption. Examples of feeling this would maybe kind of the thoughts, maybe like, oh, I'm making it worse. Oh God, I'm a racist. I shouldn't help anymore. There's no hope. I'm just so sorry, but there's no kind of action beyond those words. And lastly, I'm going to look at these two, which are connected. That's white silence and white solidarity. So white silence is complicity, and a lot of people will talk about silence being violence and it being violence. I think it's important, and I want to say here, it's not as simple as that. Things are nuanced, and we may have other reasons a lot of the time because of other elements of our marginalization and oppression, because white people can be marginalized and oppressed, of course, that may mean that you don't feel that you can say something. So that's something that we look at in allyship, and when is it safe to be an ally. But in a lot of instances, silence is complicity, and it can be one of the most powerful weapons in the arsenal of racism and oppression, is actually people not challenging, not saying anything, or not doing anything. So people seeing kind of racial injustice, they're heartbreaking, thinking how horrible this is, but not doing anything about it. Just kind of not making, you know, you by doing that, you've made space for it to happen. And a lot of the time it's felt that if you're not speaking out, again, it doesn't have to be always, but if you never speak out, then you're complicit in this system of oppression. Solidarity, white solidarity is kind of same but different, but it's when people will, for example, chuckle at an off-color joke, or kind of go along with some banter that they've heard, or yeah, kind of like even in their silence provide a level of support to someone who is being racist, because that person is like, well, if I'm not being challenged, then they must have my back, they must think the same as me. And this is a kind of tacit agreement, therefore, that protecting white privilege, and not holding other people to account for racism. It's an unspoken agreement amongst a lot of people, and it's also fed by not wanting to cause another white person discomfort, not wanting to cause that fragility in someone, and not to cause that when confronting them. It's especially prevalent in professional realms, and also in social realms for younger people, but especially in professional realms where there's a perceived risk of losing a job, or your status with your boss or your manager or your colleagues. There's the risk of rocking the boat too much. And so this risk, or a risk to our social or personal capital, leads many people to not want to take that risk. And in this way, they remain silent and complicit. So again, with that, there's things like thoughts might be, what if I lose my job? What if people don't like me? It probably didn't mean that. It's only a joke. There isn't, this is a real common one, there isn't a racialized person here, so I don't need to challenge it right now. You know, we've got freedom of speech, so I guess people can just say what they want as long as it's not directly impacting someone. So those might kind of be the things that are used to justify this solidarity. And even with some of these examples of thoughts, it may feel like you're centering other people, but actually they're all about I, and they're all centering white people. They're not doing things to consider what other people who are impacted by racism may be experiencing. Good. So, okay, I was just having a look at the time there. What I'm going to do now, and this is just a kind of, again, a presentation to get you thinking, to get you feeling. So this may and will, and probably might, and hopefully will, bring up some emotions. I'm going to go through some statements that have been shared online. There's some up here on the screen, as you can see. These are actually article headlines. These statements are from an organization called No White Saviors that are based in Kenya. Again, I'll share their link, and they do a lot of work looking at neocolonialism and combating that. So when they put these statements out, these are from their Instagram. That's my chosen form of social media, but they do other things as well. I want you to think about what they make you feel. So if they make you feel fragility or guilt, or if you may have responded with silence or solidarity, or those kind of thoughts that come into your mind, like not all white people, but it's not me. Those white centering thoughts. And if you are not white, you don't identify as white, you may still feel that kind of fragility, especially if it's the kind of work that you do. And as I said, I'll share some of my own experiences later. As we go through these, I want you to stay in tune with your feelings and your thoughts. These are, as I said, kind of bits of information. So it's important to listen to them. You're not going to share. So this is just literally for your own kind of reflection. So we've got, it's not that white people haven't committed serious harm across Africa. It's that they've had to disguise it better. With colonialism, they brought schools, hospitals, churches, and development. They've always had to maintain their domination under the guise of good intentions. Western benevolence across Africa rarely, if ever, comes without strings attached. You bring charity and development, but remain unwilling to disrupt the global power dynamics and norms that require your intervention in the first place. Africa is not poor, it is exploited. White saviorism turns people into projects, trauma and personal stories into fundraising campaigns, communities and marginalized groups into lucrative causes. Justice sees people in the fullness of their humanity and fights to uphold their inherent dignity and worth. The white savior complex convinces you that you are the answer, that you must be a voice for the voiceless. Responsible partnership requires that you pass the mic to the unheard. No one is voiceless. You've been talking over us for far too long. This is a picture of us carrying all the white people who are actually willing to give up power, if you're into memes. We need to talk about the ways in which homophobia in Africa has been established and sustained by whiteness and colonialism. Transphobia is a white supremacist legacy of colonialism. Pro tip, all that time and energy you spend trying to prove how you are not a part of the problem, you could be listening and learning about the ways in which you actually are. Good. We're going to go into another breakout room now. Before that, I said I'd share some examples of myself as a racialized person when I've read these and others. And one of the examples I wanted to show, the example I'm going to share, is regarding religion and Christianity. There's a lot around how Christianity, as we know, has come hand in hand with colonial expansion projects. And there was a highlight on Islam, and there was a highlight on people talking about how Islam is a religion of colonization as well, and has been actually used to colonize a lot of the nations that are part of modern day African continent. And being of a mixed heritage myself, part Muslim and having a Muslim mother and Muslim families, when I saw that, I got really fragile, I got really defensive, and I was like, no, how can a religion that is primarily followed by people of color, that started in the Middle East, that is seen as a religion of racialized, oppressed, colonized people, be that problematic? It's not the same as Christianity. It's not been used to colonize. This is insert expletives. And I noticed my defensiveness. I noticed it straight away. I've noticed it in regard to my considerations around people of different races and different backgrounds to myself. And I used that, and I was like, hang on, I am feeling very fragile. What is this fragility about? And so I took my time to learn, and I have learned a lot about how Islam has been used in similar ways to Christianity, as a kind of way to colonize, subjugate, and has been weaponized against people of color, as well as others, especially in the African continent. So I just wanted to share that as the experience that I've had. And in our breakout rooms, there's quite a lot of questions on this one because I couldn't decide, and I thought it can be quite a lot because it's quite heavy going through that. So there's some questions on the left there, but again, you don't have to discuss these. You could discuss anything you want. They're not recorded, they're confidential. So you might want to think about, when did you realize that racism is a thing that affects real people? Can you remember a time you witnessed racism? What do you think or feel when you hear the term white supremacy? What practical, tangible things have you done when you've realized you've been racist and wrong for it? These questions, again, are a lot more maybe targeted to people who don't experience racism. And I want to just recognize that there are people in this space who do experience racism, so they might not be for you. Additionally, if you are in a space, if in your pair you have someone who experiences racism and someone who doesn't, please, if you don't experience racism, make space for the other person. But if they don't want to talk about their experiences or their thoughts, you can just say, would you like to share anything beyond this? If they don't want to, then you can maybe answer some of these questions, but ask, are they happy to hear the answer to those questions and hear your thoughts because of what I mentioned earlier? Good. So we'll have until, about 5 minutes in this one, I think 5 or 6 minutes. And I'll try and go a bit quicker for the next. So when you're ready, Remy.
Thanks, everyone. That invite should pop up.
Nice one.
Oh, great.
Welcome back again. Right, I was just telling myself to stop waffling. It heard me do that as I start waffling. So we're going to crack on to the last theme, which has a bit more to it, term-wise, I think. So I might be talking a bit longer before you go off into your final breakout rooms. So the final theme was looking at decolonization and intercultural sensitivity. Again, I'm going to go through a couple of activities before I land the learning per se. So these are activities that I'm going to go through that normally I would do in a much more proactive, engaged way. This is for you to just kind of think as we go through. I'm not going to do it in the active sense. So I'm going to go through some definitions or terms and definitions. And I want you to kind of think, which term do you, or which definition do you think is right? Which one do you work with? Which one makes the most sense to you? Good. So civilized, to be for a people or place to be in a specific stage of social and cultural development, which is more advanced, especially in terms of social norms, or to live in a community-driven environment, but norms of behavior can be varied and different. Justice, the process of a community deciding collectively on how to work with individuals, groups, or organizations that have broken the social and behavioral rules. Or the administration of the law or authority in maintaining justice, specifically having independent judges, magistrates, and courts. Democracy, a national government in which the supreme power is vested through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Or a way of governing a group of people run by the people, especially in collective terms as they deem fit. Economically stable, The absence of excessive fluctuations in the financial macroeconomy in relation to the organization of money, of the money, industry and trade of a country with fairly constant output growth and low inflation. Or a balanced web of stable relationships in a community concerning land, life, labor, and taking care of the place and each other. Gender, either of the two sexes, male and female, including transgender men and women, considered with reference to biological difference or presentation in regard to reproductive organs or hormones. Or broadly denoting a range of gender identities considering social and cultural differences, including but not limited to cisgender male, female, intersex, transgender male, female, two-spirit, third gender. Community, a group of people with commonalities such as norms, religion, values, customs, or identity, sharing a sense of place situated in a given geographical area. Or all the relationships in a home, the people, microorganisms, plants, animals, water, soil, air, terrain, and the climate, with consideration for the complexity of these relationships. So why have we done this exercise? I run this because I think it's important to recognize that there are different understandings and definitions of the same terminology depending on the context and the culture that you're in. We can see with those examples, a lot of those you may have thought, oh yeah, that seems like it's more from here or that's more from there. Lots of them were just kind of Google top result, how do you define it? And the other ones taken from texts and definitions from different places that are not predominantly led by Western thoughts. So we can see with these examples, but these words, however, are so regularly used in our work, especially in the global solidarity international development sector. And yet, from my experience working in this sector and working with people from this sector, they're very rarely defined, or it's very rarely explored what the real definition of this is, what you define it as, what other people define it as, especially when we're working across cultural contexts. So with the statements on this slide as well, I think it's important. Again, I'm using work from No White Saviors. One thing I didn't say earlier is I always pay people as well. So I've sent money to No White Saviors. I paid their and I paid Decolonizing Economics to use their work to try and, provide some equity within the capitalist system that we maintain. Yeah, so with these statements, the only one on the left is not by No White Saviors. We need to consider these. So what is our framework? I mean, this one talks about what is a framework of respectable. People use the term respect all the time. One of our values is respect in organizations. It drives me mad because I'm like, what does that mean? What is your framework of respect and respectable? What does it mean to be respectful? So is that working? Is that colonial framework working for other people, other communities? How can we learn from others? Again, we can see here in the top right, you are a guest when you're working with communities in the global south that are not of your own. We do have a lot more people from the diaspora working on these programs, which is great, but otherwise you're a guest, so learn from people, find out what's working for them rather than going in with preconceived ideas. And we need to reconceive this concept of aid. Aid is really about neocolonialism in the largest sense. So when we think about Oxfam and IMF, the World Bank, this is processes of neocolonialism, just like the prison system in the United States was created to replicate slavery, post-Second World War, the IMF, the World Bank, and even the International Court of Justice were recreated to maintain colonial control over other nations. So we need to decolonize these thoughts. We need to think about them from different perspectives. And importantly, we need to decolonize how we measure success. Now, I know I'm saying this in a utopian world because we all work with funders and they tell you how you have to measure success. And they won't give you the money if you don't measure success in the way that they tell you how to. However, there are a lot of funding organizations also looking at changing the way that they fund, and philanthropic organizations doing the same. The definition of success, just like we looked at those other terms, is a lot of the time been defined by the West, by aid organizations, within our constructs of culture, how we perceive things like civilization, democracy, economic stability. And many times as well, we consider the kind of vision, mission, goals of organizations and create them without input from the people that we're trying to work with. And from a perspective of what we think the world should be like and what we think development looks like. It's generally white Westerners who are writing these into funding bids and funding tenders, and it's on these premises that development continues. Again, we work within capitalist funding structures. We're like, oh my God, we're not going to get paid. Our people aren't going to get paid. We're not going to get this money unless we do what the funder wants. So we work in a system that kind of traps us in a way of doing things. And even community-driven development projects, although seen as community-driven in name, are still undertaken within these funding structures that have kind of KPIs and hope for impact on communities, again, regularly defined by Western perspectives. So it's about moving from this, thinking about how we can define our metrics of success and not centering us again. You know, I've worked with organizations, they said, well, we're going to work this project and our metric is going to be finding out how do people feel about working with us. And I was like, well, it's still about you. You know, have you asked them what their metrics of success are? So it'd be interesting to kind of run, I think, these exercises with partners and think about definitions, think about language, think about terminology, and find out, if you don't already, and I'm sure a lot of people do because things are changing and have changed over years, but what are other people considering? Do you have the same understanding when you've both sat there and said, yes, what we want to do is we want to become economically stable, but you've agreed to the term, everyone's happy. Do you mean the same thing in practice? So that is what I encourage you to do as part of this kind of process of decolonizing. Moving on from that as well, decolonizing your mind, and all of this is part of that process, is really important. So all of us have, to some extent, absorbed some of the pervasive stereotypes of racism. Give me a second, I'll just have a drink. It's, you know, it's global and quite difficult to evade that. There's an author called Frantz Fanon, and this is in one of his books, and he highlights something that as well is quite commonly known, which was looking at the kind of impact of colonization and colonialism on the psyches of the colonized. And he said that the colonized individual was often stunted by a kind of implanted sense of degradation and inferiority. We talk about internalized racism, internalized marginalization, and people taking on those beliefs. If the belief is put out there that Black people are inferior, they're not going to be able to kind of block those beliefs off all the time. So it's established that the oppressed will come to doubt their own abilities as a result of the narratives that justify their statuses as second or third class citizens. So if we take that context, for those who are not marginalized, for those who are not oppressed, there should not be an assumption that they have been free from these messages of superiority. Even people who in this context and this topic feel anger at racism shouldn't assume that you haven't ever taken on those messages of superiority. To be therefore an effective ally in the struggle against racism, against other forms of oppression, with this area requires lots of things, but one of those is to reach in. So this is kind of exploring your inner assumptions, actions, behaviors, everything we've done today and beyond. And also, you know, kind of not adopting that savior mentality approach, which assumes that because of your greater privilege, somehow you're better equipped to fight the battles for those you intend to support. And this attitude needs to be adopted, whether it's in regard to race, gender, disability, sexuality, class. Otherwise, you know, you risk reinforcing rather than dismantling systems of oppression, especially in your work. And then the other one is reaching out. So with all of that, you know, we talked about it under anti-racist theory and frameworks, is being an ally to intersecting and other struggles. So reach out, offer support to those. If you're not proactively supporting Black Lives Matter, but you're working with Black people, why? Why is that not something that you're forefronting in your work? So then we move on to intercultural sensitivity, and I feel like these are connected. Everything is, I suppose. And a lot of people are now calling this cultural intelligence as well. I've heard that come up. So this is obviously recognizing that we're all different, but how do we kind of learn to accept and manage those differences? So it's a bit, again, a bit of theory for you to kind of recognize and maybe be able to afterwards reflect on how this works for you. So I'm going to actually read a story. It's a very short story that hopefully kind of demonstrates, this concept of culture. So I want you to imagine that there is a country. Actually, I'm going to pause the story and I'm going to say one thing about culture is that a lot of the time it's connected to nation states. So we think of culture being only about countries. People from certain countries have certain cultures. Please explore culture. Culture can be applied, of course, to organizations and institutions. It can be applied to subgroups. I wanted to say that because I am using countries as an example, but that is not the only defining element of culture. We know that, especially when we look at colonization, that these countries didn't exist, but there were varying cultures before the land was chopped up. So here we go, the story again. Imagine there is a country, Amarilandia, where everyone is born with 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, a nose, a mouth, and a pair of yellow sunglasses. No one has thought them strange because everyone has them. It's perfectly normal to everyone. Imagine how they would perceive the world around them. Isn't this lovely? Thousands of miles away, on the other side of the world, there is another country, Azulandia, where everyone is born with 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, a nose, a mouth, and a pair of blue sunglasses. No one has thought them strange because everyone has them. It's perfectly normal to everyone. Imagine then how they perceive the world around them. Oh, this is different, but it's also lovely. In both countries, Amarilandia and Azulandia, everything that people see is filtered through yellow or blue sunglasses. Now, there's a very curious person from Amarilandia who decided to go and visit Azulandia. They'd done their homework, so they decided they could get a pair of blue sunglasses so they could experience the country as the local people see it. So they spent 2 weeks in their blue sunglasses and really believed they learned all about Azulandia. When they got home, they told their family and friends it was a great trip and that everything was green. So what's the kind of landing message with this story? What do the glasses represent? They represent our culture. And what happened to this person who was traveling is they couldn't remove their glasses. So when we think about culture, we have to recognize that it is nigh on impossible to remove our cultural lens. I use glasses here because it's the way that we see the world. It's the way that we understand and interpret behaviors and actions of other people. This is why the concept of respect is very different for different people. And it's also impossible to remove your own colored glasses, especially the older you get. For younger people, children, this is why you get kind of this concept of third culture kids, but as you've grown up and spent time in one place, they become just part of you. So you can really, really try, but you will still maybe see something different to people who have that culture and have that lens than what they see. And so this is really key to recognize. And again, why I say to people, take time to find out from others how they see it, rather than just saying you've done your work, you've done your research, you've really tried to explore and immerse yourself, and you see it in a way. People are going to be the experts of their own experience. What are we? 14, 13. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly here click through how cultural practices can be seen through different lenses. Anyone who has respect as one of their values for their organization, I'm sure is going to be like, I'm going to go and review my values for my organization right now. And again, this might be like, what? Aren't these all positive or negative? But yeah, we'll flip through these quickly. So being early can be seen as being prepared. Some people might see it as you're pressuring them. Interrupting people can be seen as confident, yet generally here we see it as rude. You shouldn't interrupt. Offering food and drinks can be seen as polite and that you're valuing your guests or who you're working with or you're having a meeting with. In professional realms, sometimes it can be seen as corrupt or elements of bribery. Politeness, so those kind of please, thank you, after you, that we espouse very much in the UK, can be seen as respectful. Some people see it as dishonest, and I've had a lot of it, not a lot, I've had an international person I worked with here, and they said, oh, people always on the phone, you call them and say, oh, have a nice day, thank you so much for your time, thank you for being patient, I hope you have a great day. And they're like, they don't really care if you have a great day. For me, I got very fragile. I was like, no, we do, what are you talking about? And they were like, no, you don't, like, they don't know me. For them, they were like, just lying. Why do people lie all the time? And I was like, but it's just respectful. I say it. I mean, do I really care if someone has a great day? I don't know, but I still say it when I go to the shop. Have a great day. Enjoy your afternoon. It's polite. Humor. Here I am being humorous. Some people find it relaxing. Maybe some of you find it relaxing. Hopefully not, but apologies if some of you think of it as being quite unprofessional. Why did I come to the FSI webinar for someone to kind of joke around about these things? So again, can be seen differently by different people. Modesty, unpretentious, or is it not having much confidence in yourself? Shaking hands, or is it disrespectful? And compromising, giving up, you know, is it fair or equal? Or is it being weak and having a lack of conviction? So again, here I am just demonstrating that things can be different. We can sit in our own ways of seeing things, doing things. So how can we maybe look at how others do things and learn about that? As well as talking to people, there's listening. Really listen. Really listen to what are people saying, what are people doing, what are the responses of other people to that. And observe that as well. If you hear someone and you think, oh, they're shouting, that's so rude, but the people around them are laughing, well, then maybe it's not rude to them. Be open to the fact that, sorry, my dog is making some noise in the background. Be open to the fact that things can be different, and that just because you feel a certain way about it doesn't mean everyone will. So I'll come here, what's this? Be willing to ask questions, discuss differences, sorry. And importantly, I think, is checking and clarifying with people what's been said. Check your understanding, clarify and summarize. We don't do enough of that, you know, and people aren't used to it. So you may need to really try and dig deep, but don't always take your first response as what is the truth of what is being communicated to you through that behavior, action, or language. Right, so our last breakout room, and we are running 5 minutes over time, so you're going to only have 5 minutes in your pairs to discuss this, so I'm shortening it down, 5 to 6 minutes. How have you seen things differently in different cultural contexts? And have you ever discussed with your partners or people you work with in other countries how they measure success? So if we can ping everyone into breakout rooms, and then we'll be coming back for the last 5 minutes, which is just going to be wrapping up. Thank you, everyone. That's basically a wrap from me. Yeah, thank you for participating in the breakout rooms, as I think you did. It seemed like you all did, and for putting some stuff in the chat. I'm really sorry that this is more webinar style. But I do deliver interactive training. I do organizational consultancy where I work with you on a longer term. I combine training, workshops, and facilitation. So it's always bespoke. It's always specific to your needs, to the people that you're working with. And we kind of develop it together before delivery. So you will get all of my contact details. Before I pass over to Remy, who's going to share that really important Zoom poll, so please do it because it's needed for funding reporting, those KPIs that the funders want us to tell them about. I just will also share in the chat my feedback form. Please, while you're making a cup of tea or whatever you're doing afterwards, if you're happy to complete that, it's more qualitative. As a freelancer, I don't get references. I don't know how I've done, especially online, because I can't chat to you, which will kind of leave. So it's really, really helpful if you would spend a few minutes just filling that out as well, and I can share that with the FSI. And yeah, I really hope that this has sparked something for you. If there's going to be one thing that you might tell someone about today, or something that you're going to do after today, this is really an ongoing journey. I'm on it. There isn't an end game. You can't get a badge or a certificate. You will get, and I'll start flicking through these now because I'm popping over to Remy's slides, but I'll be sharing kind of all the topics that I deliver, my contacts, my resources, and the credit for other organizations that I've learned from. So that's me. Thank you. And Remy, I'll pass to you, and I'm going to stop share if that's okay while I get my feedback link up.
Thank you. Oh, I thought I was muted, but I've just realized I wasn't. So I hope I wasn't making shuffly noises by that during that last session. Just to say a really huge thanks to Layla. This has been a really excellent, important session, I think. We'll share the recording and the slides for you to sort of pass on if there are colleagues that are interested. Nice to see those comments in the chat. Thanks, everyone. Yes, big thanks to Layla. And yeah, it's obviously an ongoing, continuous conversation to be had at everyone's organisations. And there's, yeah, as Layla says, well, I won't reiterate all that because I think we know, but do keep the conversations going and share those resources. And yeah, really huge thanks to Layla, and really huge thanks to everyone who's answering the poll, because it is thank you. Yes, nice clapping. And I appreciate everyone. It's a bit of a chunk of a day, so thanks everyone who's still here and managed to make it through.
Absolutely. And yes, Uganda, not Kenya. I was just testing. Have a great afternoon. You've got 2 minutes before you got to jump into your next Zoom meeting. Take care of yourselves. Thank you. Do something nice, something refreshing. It is a lot. Shove your head out the window if it's not too cold outside. Get some fresh air. Enjoy the world that we live in. And yeah, I hope to be in touch with some of you again.